Bueno, buenos días, good morning again. Welcome once again. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Este es el panel sobre distancia crítica, responsabilidad, estrategias y variedades de intervención de las humanidades en la esfera pública. Es de alguna manera el último de los paneles temáticos, hay otros paneles de la tarde, pero es el último de los paneles temáticos que despliegan la convocatoria de este encuentro anual.
Are going to be included in this gathering this year at Universidad de Chile. So here we have this invitation under the rubrics of conmociones, critical distances, and construction of the common, where the theme axis of this conference wants to articulate somehow the commotions as an index of these themes with the critical distance and the construction of the common as the epistemology and the task of mankind, humanities. So in this panel that we're going to have now, we want to question the pertinence and the modalities, possible modalities, of the critical thinking before the immediate action that reclaim all of these events, simultaneities, and the contemporary urgencies, having responsibilities and strategies, and the different varieties of interventions of the humanities in the sphere of the public. In this sense, our horizon of questioning, right now it is placed around, inevitably, before the inertia of two modalities which have been maintained and which are fundamental of this critical distancing, inherited from the modernity and the 20th century, which have had a performance not only epistemologic, but also an influence which is decisive in the formation of the opinion, creation of opinion, and the decision-making over the public. I'm talking about, first of all, this critical thinking as an questioning, interrogation, and a showing of the conditions of possibilities of the experience, different ways in which it has been socialized, a world in a certain fashion. This is a relativization, cultural and historical, of the revolution that Kant started with the need and the electricity of this representation. It is prismatized or shown together with the recognition of a plurality of sign systems which are made in it of, with a stress or attention to the sensitive, plurals, and which are renewed and they've been created by imagination. Therefore, this critical distancing supposes paying attention not only to the ways of conceptualizing and reflecting, but also the behaviors of literature and pieces of art to overcome their capacity of projecting and solaging of what had not been represented before as such. Secondly, inevitably, we need to position this critical theory as a program of discovery and interruption of the structural ways of domination and in cultural, historical, and specific areas in order to overcome the alienation and transforming a whole world. This leads to a reflection related to the knowledge and the social praxis, just like strategies of interruption of the fracticity of, in place, the norms and the conventions which govern socialized modes of thinking, communication, and community, questioning their legitimacy in different ways of alienation. Before this inertia of this inheritance of the critical thinking that there are and where the humanities are being questioned by many different questions that cannot be avoided. Some of these questions are general questions. How could a thinking, formal or cultural and historical elements of experience can transform experience itself, the socialized way of avoiding or living in the world? If so, which are now the alternative ways of knowing, getting to know something individually or collectively, which allow to think, living, and also behaving in a committed way with the world, and unfolding their potential of emancipation, that is to say, defending liberties, freedoms, setting equalities, and promoting justice. How to create a critic, an active critic, an activist critic, responding to the many different specificities, which are linguistic, cultural, and historical, not putting them under the totalitarian methodology, which names in the academia or is used this research or inquisition. So there are some specific questions related to, for instance, how to make compatible the distance, which is suspensive of the criticism, a trial of clarifying reflexively the different ways of representations and the struggles of the present, to dismantle alienation systems, how to do that compatible with the immediateless and the urgencies of the contemporary emotions. How can we relate this criticism as an operation which intervenes tactically over the frameworks, the edges and borderlines, trying to disassemble and reassembly, not aspiring to a total disintegration? How can we make that compatible with the speech of revolt and the limitation of the power? Contrary, we may also wonder, may there be a sublimation with no critical sense, with this authority without an authority, or of this authority that is questioning the authority itself of the representation which domains what's real? Finally, just to conclude these questions, how can the critic be measured with the phenomena of late capitalism and computational one? How can the critic be activated against neoliberalism of being living as a model that prescribes every hiatus within facticity and what's possible? And also, how can the critic be located before the algorithmic logics, which domains the new topology of the virtual, before the procedure of feedback, which make the facticity a duty, that is to say, that eliminates the distance between what happens and what should happen, which is, of course, the place or the origin of the criticism. Those are just some of the many different questions that could be launched in order to provoke this session, where I thank hugely, on behalf of CHCI, CFA, here at the University of Chile, the presence of our panelists. And I will introduce them. I mean, they don't really need to be introduced, but I will introduce them from right to left. So here we have Alberto Moreira, professor of Hispanic Studies at Texas University. He's the author of many books, Interpretation and Differences, 1981, Third Space, Literature and Dual, Latin America, 1989, Exhaustions of Difference, Politics of Latin American Cultural Studies, 2002, Lines of Shades, 2008, Marionism and Inscription, the abandonment of the unhappy awareness, infrapolitics, instructions abuses, 2021, Third Space and some other narrations, 2021, and Uncanny Rest, Anti-Philosophy, 2022. He has also co-edited with Nelly Richards, Thinking in the Post-Dictatorship, 2002, and with José Luis Villacañas, he has edited the concepts, fundamental concepts of Latin American thinking, 2017. Alberto is co-editor of Common Policies, a journal of thought, and the series Border Spinnism at Texas University. I will now introduce our second panelist, Nelly Richard. She is a critic, founder, director of the Critical magazine, published between the years 1990 and 2008 here in Santiago, Chile. She's coordinator for the lecture Politics and Aesthetic Memory of the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, and she's also a PhD from Buenos Aires University, 2022. Among some other publications, national and international ones, Nelly Richards is the author of the following books: Zonas de Tumulto, Memory, Art and Feminism, 2021, Temporary Avism, Feminism, Aesthetics, Travesties, and Queer Strategies, 2018, Latencies and Unfinished Memories 2017, Dialogue, Latin American Dialogues at the Borderlines of Art 2014, Critic and Politics 2013, Critics of the Memory 2010, Feminism, Gender and Differences 2008, re-edited 2018, Fractures of the Memory, Art and Critical Thinking 2007, Residues and Metaphors, Essays of Cultural 2028, 2098, Answer for the Nation, Political Changes, Transformations, and Crises 1994, Masculine, Feminine 1993, and Borderlands and Institutions 1986, re-edited in 2007. So I will now introduce Renato Janine Ribeiro. He's a professor of ethics and philosophy, political philosophy at Sao Paulo University. He has made an effort of thinking a philosophy, political one, considering societies which give more importance to the affection in public life, stressing the theoretical elements in the reconstruction of democracy in Brazil, areas called the Third World. We are going to name some of his books: Society and Social, Self-Cause of Public, Life in Brazil, Jaguti Award, and University and Current Life, Fellini Did Not Watch Any Movies, 2003. We need to highlight, in the year 2015, Renato Janine Ribeiro was named Minister of Education in Brazil by the President Dilma Rousseff. And 2021, 2 years ago, he was elected, and he's still the president of the Brazilian Society for Progress of Sciences. And before that, in 1998, he received this award for scientific work and the Order of Rio Branco. After these presentations, and once again being really thankful for you being here, I will open the floor. I will give the floor from right to left. Thank you very much, Andrés. I want to thank, first of all, Paulo Yarzun, Andrés Claro, Constanza Ribano, the consortium, and Universidad de Chile. It is a pleasure and honor to be here in this conference. So these days, checking material for a course that I need to teach this year between Central American conflicts, I read the novel of Karina Pacheco Medrano, The Forest of Your Name. The novel is in the repression, genocide, in Guatemala in the 60s up until the 90s, 20th century. In those years, it was about the bloody doctrine that the U.S. has imposed in Latin America after the Second World War and during all of the Cold War. We may think that those policies, if they can be called policies, if they deserve that name, corresponded to a prior way of capitalism, not ours, not the one that we have now. But nothing leads to think, on the other hand, that the defense of capitalism and contemporary capitalism does of their own interests in our near future, it is going to be more delicate or softer. There will proliferate some disruptions in its functioning which are going to threaten the hegemonic structure which exists now. It is also important to think that the next confrontation, when Anthropocene, it is revealing its other name, Anthropocene, as Bernard Stiegler calls it, talking about the second law of thermodynamics, threatening some lives on the planet is not going to be gentle. Therefore, it might be possible, I hope I'm wrong, that we may not see nothing at all about the human capability for cruelty of destruction. Possibly Guatemala, the land which its name means forest, it is something that we need to take care of. In 1939, Martin Heidegger, away from the revolution, claims and says that politics is a machination in one of his black books. The revolution says politics cannot be done if the revolution, it is first of all a revolution against the politic machinery. And in 1843, its first seminar starts talking about thinkers, essential thinkers in Western places as the real political thinkers. So we are between the rejection of policies and the declaration of what is politics itself. So which is political itself? And there's a note in the black notebook. So therefore, somehow it is anti-politic. It depends of being or having a decision where what is needs to be decided, it is, I quote, if the blend of power can be experimented as the forgetting the self of the if human beings are still worthy of being installed beyond power and impotence. Beyond power and impotence.
Without a doubt, our world does not work like that. But we make it the non-inhuman in the greatest part of our existence infrapolitically. Why not to give that phrase its proper range? Why not to put it there as a dressing room towards a second revolutionary begin? In the previous panel, Alejandra Castilla said that the philosophy reproduces the centric. I would like to talk about whether this called anti-philosophy supposes an anthrocentric order, or if it matches what Veronica Gago, in one of her books, calls the feminist power that wants to change everything. But that's will be for a later conversation. Stigler, in a late book in which where he somehow announces a feeling extractor taking him later to commit suicide, The Age of Disruption, claims that our time is precisely a ageless age, because it does not allow the projection of tertiary pretensions, preparing or not preparing a future. Our historic moment is growth, the moment where the being for the death is open for the first time in the human species to a possible totality of death, finding no compensation in our legacy, whether this is cultural, scientific, civilizational, existential, or in the trust for life for our descendants or coming generations. Fear, a language domain, and partially explains certain catastrophes, such as the Chilean one, the one we have talked about these days. Of course, our relation for Stile, there's no any type of pessimism or optimism. One or another, pessimism and optimism will be emotional replies, insufficient ones, motivated or dictated by fleeting disposition and denial regarding an insolid and unmerited predicament by the subjugated definitions to imperialist word and collective destruction. The condition of this age of disruption is not only for climate change, but probably fundamentally to the hyperstructural domination of the computational capitalism, the exhaustive monetarization of human capital, in short, of an absolute exacerbation of the representational calculation and the general principle of equivalence as a final legacy in its double eschatologic and teleological sense of the bourgeois hegemony that Western has imposed in the whole planet. It's about, in other words, of an nihilism exacerbation that the West history has been preparing as at the beginning, consumed in the Western modernity. These two nihilism Friedrich Nietzsche was thinking of, incomplete and consumed, we have to add a third figure, the terminal nihilism, configuring our Anthropocene under the denomination of endless extraction techniques, such as financial extraction, the one Veronica Gago referred to on the first day. And for Heidegger, he proposed the name of, there is a fourth nihilism, which is the affirmative. Jack Lubency refers to it, and I won't have any time to talk to it. But Stilger doesn't want to be pessimist or optimist. He thinks that an anthropic extreme moment can still provide a ways detour, existence's bifurcation, where there is like a second start, that it wouldn't be today a second start of the west or east start, but it would be a second start of the non-inhuman world. Everything relies upon that. Finally, what Marx called the dictatorship of bourgeoisie is West. Then it is worth thinking what it would be about, the second step would be about, and I would like to suggest this possibility, just like Stille does in some non-verses in the third Piria Pindaro Ode. Pindaro says, well, no Greek, the English would be, do not yearn, dear soul, in mortal life, but try to take to the top the use of possible. The difficulty to us is how to understand the Practum Manhattan, above all, how to understand that from our mortal condition. Finally, taking anything to the maximum, in this case the use of possible, is consistent with the endless extraction practices that is taken to an anthropic planet of a non-inhuman standpoint. The thing here in Pindaro is to understand that the pragma comes from the shame, from the eidos, not from the hybris or hybris, and is not consistent with the will of the immortal goddess protecting the world. The hybris destroys, practicing the scheming in consistency with the goddess is an activity subject to the shame of non-inhuman. That was forgotten. Therefore, forgetting this marks the politics both in the right wing and in the left wing. Heraclitus knew that the wise mortal, as wise, authentically political, and none of the non-human destinations should match the extraordinary, and the false model to pay attention only to ordinary, only to what's useful and may seem efficient in our lives, only to what daily appears as it is, and everything that is hybris. The first beginning, along with other figures, well, other figures apart from Heraclitus, Pindaro himself, say that they contribute to fund and they see consequently prudent mercy open to what's extraordinary, computational traditional capitalism. But that tradition is not new, and its history matches the metaphysical history, absorbing its essential features the Christianism history, which is fully the history of nihilism. This is why God's death, Kant announces that in the amoral law, and Hegel consumes, and Nietzsche explicitly puts in circulation, away from giving way to a liberating secularization, supposes the resign to a non-theologic fundament of the action, spoiling all exception and all transgression. The loss of the regulated legislation principle in the equitological relation spoils the relation and gives way to the anonymity. The ageless age is its consequence. Lacan said by reversing Dostoevsky, if God exists, nothing is allowed. The Anthropocene, in their anthropic perception in where everything will start being permitted, will depend on the corruption, gradual and millennial, from the first principle of the thinking in West. For Heraclitus, it was important to find a syntony between non-human logos and the earth logos. We could also claim that the Heraclitean doctrine of the logos is the first version of what Alberto many years later would call communist hypothesis. Then it would be worth to wonder if the homologein Heracliteo, where it is historically in the first moment the communist possibility, is to be on today, or whether we need to go beyond the first beginning to rethink something different, an anarchist or an anarchic or anarchist hypothesis. The turning point or tension point between these two hypotheses has to do with the possibility of hijacking what's common in favor of power, where left and right would be indifferentiated. to co-agree, to co-say the homology between the non-human logos and the earth logos of the world, or the earth world, given the necessary between them, takes to the general communism, or whether it is taken to an anarchic praxis. Everything depends if we conceive these logos of the earth as a principle and command, which is the constant hybris in the history of metaphysics, or rather how precisely this does not respond to principle and is not articulated as principle, and is therefore literally anarchist, without principle or without beginning. From this perspective, I would like to add that anarchic is not conceivable as an option or political decision, a personal win. Well, you see, I'm anarchist, I'm communist, so well, I am liberal, whatever. But it would be important to put it as a condition of the politics itself, the condition of what's political in the general absence of principles, in the general absence of legitimacy of principle. From there, something like a democracy, post-hegemonic democracy could be built. Catherine Malabou, in her extraordinary book, even unfair sometimes, about the anarchistic dimension in the post-Heideggerian thinking, called To the Thief, Anarchism Philosophy, mentioned the system of what she called none to be governed, opposed to what cannot be governed. The second, this is the what cannot be governed, is still in direct relation to the power. If what cannot be governed from the power standpoint appears, for example, in the Chilean revolt, what's not governed claims outside the power. And regarding impotence, I would like to propose that what's not governed so Malibu, if it matches the planetary logos, encloses the secret of the possibility to leave the terminal nihilism behind at the precise moment that would agree with the affirmative nihilism. Maybe what's not to be governed serves to that possible symptom proposed by Heraclitus regarding the human capacity to correspond the logos of the earth against any hybris, in shame and in attention by the will of the gods, and saying the teaching the way of the gods. There would be a second possible beginning that would be through a return to the city around all ontic possibility and the metaphysics misunderstood as a principal or beginning region, archic region. The nihilism is a consequence of the destruction, since everything that is entity and the being is not entity. The region is the space-time in what is installed. We talked about Gaia as the last or more modestly of the Platonic Hora, when it is convenient to say that Plato didn't know what to do with her. In Heraclitus, the Hora appears as a Kierkegaardism of pantheon, which Heidegger translates as the surrounding region, or the surrounding guaranteeing that might be a region. Aiming to return to that region is to desecularize our world without re-theologizing, because it's desecularizing not on behalf of our return to the theological principles such as the one Aristotle believed, but an abandonment of the metaphysical articulation of history and returning to chain before the guts Pindaro talked about. I have to take on the call for this panel by assuming that, to me, the thinking in the present is not prioritarily critical, and it doesn't look for critical distancing. Responsibility is derived. What's necessary might start being possible to find an exit of the ageless age and start the way to another era age in the world is just a proposition. I am not sure if the humanities institutes or universities in general are willing to take these on their shoulders. Rather, I believe the opposite. Today, the university is an direct accomplice of the condition of things, even when their members assume being thinking positions on behalf of injustice and equality. They are positioned still in link to the metaphysical structuration of history, sharing the illustration. Even the metaphysics critic, even the destruction of metaphysics are today additional devastation devices. We have to take one step back, but also we need to take displacement outside destruction and against devastation. And thus the distance, the title of this panel refers to, would be distance from the archic of the kainomia, subject to principle and command, which our Fabius has articulated as a general equivalence and general subjugation, and what's away, or rather beyond that. There's been a prior transformation of thinking, and there wouldn't be thinking transformation for a prior configuration, existential configuration. Terminal nihilism, however, forces everything that there is no other option, even if we choose somnambulic way, the third paramenia via, adhering to the second one, since it is not terminal, not generative. Steele refers to that, and this is what they appeal to what's not governed. Before them, there are certain works by Jacques Derrida and Rainer Schurman. The desecularization notion, which Ribeiro briefly explores, to reply a Vincenzo Vitello interpellation. It appears such as the possibility in the Derrida text to leave some subjects behind, such as mechanisms. In other words, the thing about promises and what's forthcoming. The desecularization is not the promise, but also the fulfillment of nihilism, expiration. We still have to get there, and it's not easy. And in relation with that, we have the possibility to abandon the oxymoron Schurman proposes as a motive or reason for thinking in what for him is the ageless age. Schurman talks about a tragic condition not to be overcome for any type of appeal. Let's remember that's a panel that I hide again. The arche is the beginning, historical beginning of nihilism. One tragic condition condemns us to a double bind. And he thematizes as a principle of anarchy. Principle of anarchy, that's an oxymoron. In my opinion, it would be convenient to abandon that imprisonment condition. There is no double bind. There is, rather than that, there is a way to a second beginning where the possibility of a new joy is open. Let's remember Pindar verses I quoted before. Do not yearn for the immortal life, but aim to maximize your possibilities as a mortal. Take care of your world, your life. There's nothing better to do, even when that needs to be understood, and understand it, not understand it as the bifurcation. That's an anarchic decision, and as anarchic is a fugitive in favor of a terminal nihilism of the age, and that's the decision that somehow might be start to be thought of through the work of the Institute of Humanities, so sessions like this, in order to survive to the confrontation that's coming, even when nobody becomes the winner. Thank you very much.
I'll give the floor to Nelly Richard. Good morning. And I will start by thanking for this invitation. I want to thank the organizers of this colloquium, especially Paulo and Andrés and Carlo and Constanza. I must say, it is a pleasure to share this table. I hadn't seen Alberto for quite a long time, but we were at so many different roundtables during the 80s and the 90s in the USA about cultural studies in Latin America, subalternity, and some others. And I feel in a really comfortable situation. Well, so I want to say that I took these words. I followed, literally, the invitation of the words, concentrating my attention in this question of critical distance. Introducing this notion had an important value. It was an invitation, a provocation, because at least in the local scenario, the writings about this revolt from the left wing, or as Willie Tyer would say, from the left part, it was a writing which is manifested through a knowledge which is bubbling, which poetry of the affection. It is exactly in the type of what is called critical distancing, and it is also, I think, it is interesting to work with this impertinence. So the text or the presentation, it's called Between Vertigo of the Whole, the Revolt, and the Tactical Joint of Borderlines. We know that the word commotion talks about an alteration and perturbation which is violent, a precipitation, and something that interrupts their normality, which is political and social, which transform the perception and also the awareness. This was the revolt of October 2019 here in Chile. It shook the whole country. So the left wing lived this paroxysm of the revolt, its aspiration to the whole disintegration of an unfair system, and that was the moment where it was important to fight, where the popular was once again heroic. It turned into a hero because for the transition years it turned into the people as a mass and a factory of tame attitudes. The intellectual world adhered to this revolt of October 2019, wrote in an inspired and inspiring writings by the animosity, by a feeling which was intense, and the fascination, subjective fascination, of willing to get or to agree with the uprise of the whole structures of power. An uprise that was read in a sublimation code by Mauro Salazar. Those revolts writings embrace the different bodies, embracing, that is to say, holding them in their arms to show appreciation, which is the contrary of what it is understood reflexively by critical distancing. It was an insurgency, and it was about vibrating all together by people in the street who could not accept any negotiation, with the animality of the revolt and their new barbarians who woke up in Chile. Oscar Cabezas mentioned that. With the ungovernability of a people, of a country, Rodrigo Carne, and by its anarchy of the senses, Sergio Villalobos Robino. Question. In this blast of destruction and saving and redentor activities, can we talk about the critical methodology? I prefer to talk about this critic as an operation, that is, a set of operations which in each detour of context creates some ways of articulating different powers, which are going to give paths to different shapes of subjective emancipation, static ones, without really waiting the accomplishment, absolute accomplishment of a promise or revelation of this social change or political change. The writings of this revolt celebrated their dislocation force from everything which was as an institution. They were not under any power, allocating the graduation, extreme gradation of a phenomenon. Since it was not measured by the practical reason, it exceeds the judgment. What happens then with this critic in order to judge? According to the etymology of the word critic, which is associated to crisis, because it shares the same inflection of being a decisive moment in an important matter. It is supposed that this critic, it is an intellectual operation that is about setting a distinction between the different parts of a whole, practicing this reasoning through an analytic of the judge or judgment. How can we ask this critic to set or to create a distinction if right in the middle of this crisis, all of the writings of this revolt has expressed the explosive desire of not respecting the different limits of what is different to get melted in a whole, the whole of what is common in the streets, of what is infinite, which is not common, which magnitude, it is not covered by anything. That whole, which was so excited during the revolt, wanting to eliminate any principle of reason, including judgment, trust in this illimitation, in the excess of this force that cannot be tamed, and it cannot be even mentioned, Mauro Salazar, which evokes with something which is sublime, beauty and horror of something which is beyond the political representation. A first difference between these writings of the revolt and the field of operation of the critique as a singular interruption, not general, of the different ways of power. This is not offered, quote Nicholas read in his book about Foucault, that is not offered as a total disobedience or an absolute ingovernance way. This is a practical resistance which is localized and which is specific, that maneuvers around the borderlines. Foucault said that, I quote, "The critic, it is the truth of the analysis of the boundaries and the reflections about them." Instead of wanting to eliminate the limits which support the order in order to start a domain of freedom which is total, without any restriction or bonds, the critic, as a circumscribed exercise which is limited, works in the joints of all of the different pieces, both for reassembling them all in unexpected combinations, and also to exhibit the different divisions which are fragmenting this myth of the total unity. The writings of this revolt identified that which the people fought against: the capital economic logics, the neoliberal violence of abuses, the authoritarian design of the police and legal state, the political organic of the Constitution of 1980, written by Pinochet, the elite governments and their bureaucratic techniques of the consensus and negotiation, democracy, market democracy, and so on. The writings of the revolt exacerbated the opposition between the unhappy multitudes, the street, people in the street, and the inside of the politics, which is being domesticated and contaminated by the mediation and the institutional pacts or agreements. The critics suspects of this opposition, which is dichotomic, inside or outside, because as every single rigid binaryism doesn't offer any way out, but the struggle between contrary polarities, which the only alternative is to eliminate themselves, one another, not having the possibility to try some blendings. The obliquity of this third space, Alberto Moreiras, which admit these contrapositions and also the juxtapositions which are hybrid. Coming back to the critic, the intellectual operation of setting a distinction demands, as suggested by Judith Butler, to have into consideration all of the frameworks which are going to frame the different performativity fields of the bodies and the things that have been mentioned in order to create assembly necessarily scenes within a context which is always subjected to limits and limitations. Butler says there is no scene without an implicit delimitation of the context. And this is the function that the framework has. This framework that wants not to be seen and that the critical theory is going to frame in order to hide the cultural ideologies which set the separation between what's visible inside and what is outside. While the imaginary of the revolt wants to eliminate all of the frameworks because they restrict the infinite of this destitute pollution coming from the street, the critic works with frameworks and borderlines in strategic zones from where they activate tension between inside and outside. It does it with some cross-sectional displacement and verbal intersections between different areas. Instead of this radical outside of the rebuilt exodus of the people on the street as an untamed territory to which the writing associated to revolt are, this critic goes through these different places, placing itself intermittently in this inside or outside of the legal representation frameworks as the powers fight or develop their struggle. This critic, by Butler, I quote, is not a negation or distraction act of the reality, end of quote, it is not a negation or distraction act of reality which is between desire of the revolt, that everything it is crumble apart. This is the deconstructive maneuver of a subjectivity which is positioned that creates diagrams of resistance at a scale level, that is to say, measuring the tacticity of the relation between what's desirable, utopic vector, and the grammar of transformation of a structure which are offered by different possibilities, or which offer different possibilities. In the writings of the revolts lead us to this violent agitation, fervor, furor of a strength which is so strong, which covers everything, which is an endless, powerful. How can we practice what this invitation to this activity calls this critical distancing, in which the self-reflexivity of judgment is based on? What should we understand by critique? We all know that the defense, modernist defense of the critique, is based in the hierarchy of an absolute judgment, which is superior, non-biased, transcendent, has been totally refuted by the questionings, feminist, post-colonial, and other questionings, which legitimate the universality of this canon. We can only speak about a critique which is willing to transcendent. We cannot expect from the critic the normative, guideline, or prescriptive one, which has a program, a method, or a discipline, which is ruled by the canon of a scale of values. When we assume that the faculty of judging, it is not absolute anymore, but it is local and at a special place it is relative and contingent, we're talking about a critique which does not apply judgment. It does not dictate any sentences, but it experiments with it, trying randomly with actions of measuring, cutting, dividing, choosing, deciding, which are parts, non-categoric parts of the judging. Experimenting with judgment means to put into the test its capability of defending some options of value and sense without any authority fundament and with no any warranty in exchange. Though we shouldn't talk about critical distancing because it does not exist an exteriority where we can safeguard judgment, may then critique have this distance as a result which is valid, not only to get sheltered in the farawayness of an unprotected area, but to move between separations and joints in this come and go which is fractionated of this contour representation. In his beautiful book about Brecht, D.D. Huberman talks about this, taking possession of the knowledge, saying the following, I quote, "We don't know anything in the itself, in the cover of the too close. We won't know anything about the abstraction, pure abstraction, the transcendence which is too high, the high which is too far away. In order to know, we need to take a position, which means moving. That movement is getting closer and also getting far away. Separation, getting closer with some reserve, separation with some desire. It supposes some contact, but it supposes it in an interrupted manner." End of quote. The thinking of the revolt by one of their authors, Jesse, denies to or doesn't want any interruption, separation between bodies and situations, celebrating, in words of Andrea Cavalletti, I quote, "the trial of getting to know those actions, the revolts, almost imitating them in the intense pace of the prose, from a viewpoint which is not exterior, but it is absolutely empathic. It is a surge which is phenomenological, which acts guaranteeing from the inside the objectivity of the revolt and its experiences of time." End of quote. While the writings of the revolt want to with this proximity, without necessarily with the street, to get together unconditionally with the people and the revels and sharing from the inside all of the different flows, expansive flows of its power, which is effective, the critic resolves to interrupt the contact in order to alter different modes of approximation, identification, and separation, de-identification, which crack the self-realization of some as the people as a whole that cannot be divided. The writing of the revolt hate the separation, and they prefer the fasten of chaos, while the critic works with distance, which is intermittent, and there are intervals there in order to modulate the space and time, considering some breaks and restarts which not aspire to what it is not measurable. When the solved dilemmas of this totality, which is both an act, the philosophical self-dimension of the revolt provokes a loss of the object and the subject, which are under an uncontrolled force. It is a force which is so strong that has no end and has no ceiling. This unendless revolt, this is announced prophetically, it happens, and then later, even after the decay, intensive decay of its vital energies, it continues to appear as a ghost in a threatening way, making you think about the total destruction, which are writings, which desire it and do not want to resign to its fatigue. This never-ending revolt does not admit anything except anything between order and chaos. Nothing in between can be there, nothing there which could be useful for the common lives, a substitute of an order, even though this is fragile. Not to be under this frenzy of the discivilization which is permanent. The critic, on the contrary, admits the policies which are in between, which come from these spaces and cuts which are practiced in this uninterrupted continuum of the never-ending revolt in order to separate and distinguish different figures which do not have to surrender to the apocalypse of the representation. Saving some of these figures from the total depletion, it is useful for this fragmentation condition, and the broken pieces are not inserted, leads the theoretical imagination to try creatively with the different procedures of the assembly. The first element destroyed by the revolts we have read it by Rodrigo Carmi, who have explained it clearly. It is the chronological linearity of the historical time due to the strong force of this now, which is not subordinated to anything or anyone. The intempestive force of the now as a savage moment would make the revolts free by asking to a possible future, because this would betray the exceptionality of the moment. They are living as an intransitive cut. There wouldn't be how to judge, just to coming back to the vocabulary of the critic, the future of the revolt in terms of success or failure, because they just want to leave themselves as something which is epiphanic of the dislocation, absolute dislocation of the space and the time of the policies and politics. In this sense, it is quite revealing that the first fracture which is created in the left wings, are the ones, after the uprise, are the ones related to how can we continue when they have the possibility to sign or not this agreement for a new constitution on the 15th November 2019. The left wings wonder, first of all, do we need to leave free all of the energies, popular energies which are uncontrollable, even knowing that they may fail, in order to be loyal to a principle of anarchy, multiplicity, or maybe if these energies must be reconverted towards a transforming project instead of burning in this fire. Though the transformation there, it is being conditioned by institutional dimensions of the political scenario that enables it. The fracture of the left wings related to the agreement had to do with the tension between, on the one hand, projecting the revolt of October as a maximum, the highest fantasy of non-contention, rejecting anything, any framework, institutional framework, and on the other side, assuming all of those borderlines and frameworks as a pathway that they give a delimitation, they're susceptible to be modified by this concept of frontier, borderline, which include inside, outside, institution, and policies, and the people. The disagreements, if to sign or not a new constitution, reiterated the type of dilemma that usually affect left wing between revolts and revolutions. We need to aspire to the whole, waiting things to happen maximalistically, the joint of conditions which have been declared as optimal in order to materialize a decisive change. In our case, the statement of a sovereignty which is popular, represented in a real constituent assembly, or shall we assume it segmented in a transformational horizon of society and politics, which is acknowledged only partially and in a complete fashion, but nevertheless, it allows to modify structures of power, which are already constituted. I am about to finish. Someone might say, even though the unfair and selfish, that somehow this whole or nothing of the revolt has us where we are at in this sinister world, because the celebration of this power that the revolt created an authoritarian restoration, a fanatic restoration of the order which is repressive, which let us know in an avenging way that the powers that the revolt wanted to eliminate as a whole never stopped being operative in this outside of the framework of those texts which gave their first lyric and insurrectional boost to all of the things that want to eliminate the former. Even though, does this mean that we need to renounce the revolt as a figure of untamed thinking? Of course not. The imaginary of this revolt and their disobedient energies will still be part of our vital archives, and we will remember them every time the present it is too overwhelming. But maybe we need to disassemble and reassemble all the different figures of this imaginarium of the revolt in a different way to the one mentioned by this intransigent cut of the destruction, refoundation, absolute refoundation that promised to destroy all of the machinery of power, neoliberal ones. The critique is recognized in those regions that Benjamin Darditi calls interstitial. Some regions, I quote, which are not characterized by the domination, pure domination, neither for the absolute liberty or freedom, end of quote, but by the possibilities of having in their maps some emancipation gestures which offer some alternatives to this all or nothing. These interstitial zones are used to connect these assemblies, this arrangement with some compositive willingness of what is social, frameworks, and borderlines. So the inergacity of the revolts does not finish or is not being used by violence, which is neo-fascist, which forces on demonstrating, they do it, their efficacy in eliminating everything. Thank you very much.
Renato, the floor is for you. I start by thanking you, Andrés and Paulo, for your invitation to this Congress. I'm very happy to be one more time in Chile. I will talk about the democracy in our times. What we have to talk about, this critical distancing, make us to refer to two different points and probably points in conflict. The first one is the scientific seriousness, and the second one, the commitment. The commitment, the political commitment of human sciences, or probably humanities, started probably with the anthropologists. Let us remember the focus of the heretics of the three social sciences. First, political sciences values modernity. They want to modernize their social and political relations. Second, sociology on the opposite, poverty as effects of the social stratification and inequality in society. And third place, anthropology does not believe in modernity and even fascist. An anthropologist needs to value equally all the cultures, old and modern, West, East, all of them. And anthropology probably has been the first science to have many or most of its scientists as militants. Example, in the 8 countries sharing the Amazonia in South America. This militant attitude has spread in the last years to many other human sciences. But militant doesn't have the same logic that science. Science has that commitment to the truth. And at the same time, science is distancing itself from the world in the last decades. Many great inventions and all discoveries from the 20th century emerged from the defense and war. The atomic bomb was the most visible result of such commitment to war. But Vietnam and Iraq wars followed the same track. Then, which is the most important scientific invention or discovery during the last century? Until some time ago, we would say the nuclear bombs. Today, it's quite possible that we will suggest it has been DNA. Scientists are leaving work behind and focusing rather on human and planetary health, such as the One Health project, all around the world, which also encompasses animals, vegetation, and environment. This also means that a discussion originally focused on humanities, such as the one of pacifism and social inclusion, has been spreading towards other sciences. Biologists, physics are more concerned about the global warming, the defense of ecosystem, the Amazonian one. Science is living word and espousing peace and well-being and longer and better lives for both humans and other living beings. This means that a concern with the ethical uses of science is growing. The example of the society I've been presiding until 25, the Brazilian Association for the Advancement of Science, is interesting. We have struggled against Brazilian dictatorship in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And recently, we opposed to the authoritarian attempts of Bolsonaro. But most of all, we have been fighting for life, especially against COVID, a pandemic that has been supported by the Bolsominion, as we call the supporters of our former president. Well, how can we respect the commitment to truth, which is one of the main values of all sciences, of all rigorous knowledge, and at the same time commitment to the ethics of equality among all human beings? Of course, it is possible that one commitment will jeopardize the other one. A very militant engagement may blind people, including scientists, to their own shortcomings. I do not think the rebirth thing would happen. As a faculty member, I try never to be sectarian, even if my beliefs are to the left of the political spectrum. I always show my students the values from both liberalism and socialism. But there's a point I will never renounce: democracy. Because without democracy, both liberal and socialist regimes will have more flaws. What's important is that liberalism is not a synonym of neoliberalism. For instance, in Latin America, many of us would be quite glad if our right wing would be inspired from Angela Merkel or Emmanuel Macron. The problem we face here is that our rightists quite often appeal to the extreme right when they feel their power is threatened by even moderate leftists. And this is what happened in Brazil. Fernando Henrique Cardoso's party, PSDB, has been defeated in the 4 presidential elections from 2002 to 2014, and then it supported the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, an impeachment without a legal basis. This attitude meant that the PSDB, that became the right wing after these 4 elections, became the extreme right and need before the extreme right, and ended up taking Bolsonaro to the presidency. Actually, in all 3 presidential elections we had in Brazil since 1945, the candidates to the left, not necessarily from the left, those candidates to the left defeated the right-wing candidate, except when the right appealed to outsiders, and 3 of the 4 successful right-wing candidates were people mentally unbalanced, or almost so, as well as extremists. I refer to Janine Quadros in 1916, Fernando Collor de Mello 30 years later, Bolsonaro 30 years later. The only one of them who was neither mad or extremist was a former left-wing political scientist, Cardoso, and he lived in Chile. He's very well known here. Then we have had 13 or 12 democratic elections from 1945 to 1960, and then from 1989 to 2022. We always had a candidate to the left and one to the right, and that does not mean that we always have left-wing candidate, because left and wing are not substances but positions. They are not absolute terms but relative terms one to another. Then we always had a right-left dispute. The candidate rather to the left won 8 elections, his adversary won 5, and the last one in 2018, this election was rigged because what we call lawfare, the political manipulation of Justin asked Lula, the favorite candidate, ensuring the victory of Bolsonaro, the president, the worst president we have ever had. Usually, the poor vote to the left and the riches to the right. But since there are the right appeals to the ideology in order to make poor people vote against their own interest in modern Latin America, this means they will appeal to evangelic churches and to an agenda of what we call behavior. They will say leftists want young people to be gay and to destroy family. This explains an important displacement, although minoritary, from a part of the poor people to the right. In Brazil, around one-third of poor people voted for Bolsonaro, while one-third of the people with more money voted for Lula. In these two cases, the preference of the poor was to the right and the rich preference to the right, but with important difference. To have a democracy, it is crucial that the two main political forces are committed to some core democratic values, that is, freedom of speech, of organization and of vote, but also committed to some measure of social rights. People must be protected from hunger and poverty. And here lies a big problem in Latin America and in what used to be called Third World. Right-wing politics will not prioritize social policies. Probably the most democratic in our part of the world will be excited for social politicals. So it is impossible to have democracy with hunger and poverty at a great scale. This takes us to two consequences. First, if we to have a democracy, these two should awake democratic values in poor countries, the right wing will not be that committed with the democracy, and the democracy is in danger if only the right respect it. Secondly, this is not yet an exclusive problem of the poor countries. In many rich countries such as United States, Italy, France, and even Spain, they all face today an important menace coming from the right wing that has allied with the extreme right of our right. In the United States with Trump, the Republican Party, in France with Le Pen, in Italy with Meloni, and Spain with the Vox alliance. All this is an important problem. In the United States, for example, the Republican Party is no longer a party that accepts democracy. It is a clique of people who live from and for hatred. And this means that in the core itself of the developed world, democracy is menaced. To conclude, it is necessary to have right-wing parties that are democratic. I repeat, Merkel is an example that should be present in our countries. But this is very difficult if, when decisions are to be taken, our right-wing politicians will ally themselves to the far right, which is more effective than them in gathering strong popular support, since it will appeal to hatred instead of the positive affections, to use the language of the philosopher Spinoza. I have to add that the left has militants, people that are on the street and propose idea. Right wings do not have militants. People from the right prefer to make money, and it became far right. People who make on the right the same activity that those from the left in Brazil appeal to political changes, they are already in the far right. What happened in front of the headquarters after the elections, who made Lula victorious. When the groups started to claim a coup d'etat to end what we still have left from democracy after 4 years, terrible years, with this said. And I would say that as a researchers and faculty members, we should refrain from trying to make our students follow our values. I support the left-wing politics in my country and elsewhere, but I always try to show my students the legitimacy of both liberal and socialist politics. But as I said, I distinguish between liberalism, which is an ethical standing about the internal richness, not monetary for each individual, and neoliberalism, which is an egocentric ideology of the world of all against all. It is important to distinguish between the right and the far right, even when the right is today seduced by the far right, what happens in Brazil, in Chile, and United States, France, for countries where the far right lost the last elections. There's no more right wing, and it's possible that the far right win the coming elections, which is a great danger. Democracy is the main value we have. We need to expand it. I think an important task for the progressive forces in the world, I do not talk about the right, but I refer to the progressive forces in the world, is to democratize two areas. First, the labor relations, which are still subject to the whims of economic power. Second, the affective world, meaning love relationships, whether they are conjugal ones, in the family, or even friendship. I am used to say that democracy has become a magnet word, meaning it attracts accessory meanings. Democracy means originally the power of the many, or the people, or the plan. But in our days we talk about democratic parents, democratic teachers, and even democratic bosses, even though when parents, teachers, and bosses are never elected. But to call them democratic means they respect and hear people who are technically under their authority. Democracy means today a lot of good things, so we need to expand it. And one last point, I remember the anthropogenic, the great sociology, French sociology, died 2 weeks ago. He was a very good friend to Latin America. He used to be married to a Chilean woman, Adriana. They had children. Almost the minister, prime minister last year in France, he gave an interview. It was published after his death, and that was to a Brazilian journalist 20 years ago, Alberto Duarte Blom. In that interview, he said that he felt optimism regarding Lula's victory in thinking of the first mandate, and he said that the main problem of Latin America is a sort of inaction. It's a continent, it's a subcontinent where people do not act as much when they have to act, that people do not struggle as much as they should struggle. I believe that this is still a suggestion. Thank you very much.
Bien, tenemos 15 minutos para un debate, conversación.
Or if you want to skip lunch, and you can gather here later. But we're going to do a pool of questions, and we're not going to answer questions individually. I would ask, the microphone is going to go around. You can do 5, 6, 7 questions, whichever we have, and then we're going to give the word to each of our speakers. Okay?
Gracias por las intervenciones. Quería hacer una pregunta a Nelly sobre el carácter de la revuelta.
This revolt and what it means, because I feel that when you introduce this narration of the revolt, there's some. It is spontaneous. You mention it as spontaneous. So there is an event, a spontaneous event. It is like I've got the impression that there's no framework. This is like an archive that somehow it creates different practices. So in that sense, I'd like to know, how do you see that situation, how it occurs? Is it something totally spontaneous, or there's something like an archive or an alteration of different archives that create different practices? Thank you very much. I've got a question for Alberto. We had a conversation yesterday night, last night. So my question is, what do you think, what is the relation between what cannot be governed and this principle of the anarchy in the sense, as Schutman says, and the totality of death that you talked about? Because it made me wonder, it made me think not only about this debate about anthropogenics, but also in the whole debate about this, the atomic bomb after the Second World War, which was Andrés' work about, especially thinking the world under the possibility of its alienation. So I believe it is, those are two principles that I don't really understand. The relationship between those two elements. To say it in succinctly, I don't really understand which are, according to you, according to your proposal, what is the development of what is non-governable, or what is that cannot be governed. It is a policy of the secession, separation, alienation in a post-apocalyptic world? Or do you think which is done through revolt mechanics, the possibility of a clash between the totality of death and this principle of anarchic of the things that cannot be governed? I felt fascinated about your lecture, and I'm still wondering about it. I've got many questions, to be honest. Thank you very much for your lectures. They were so very interesting, the three of them. So I'd like to have a clarification, if possible. If you could explain or go deeper, the other two panelists may also go deeper into or about the end of Mr. Ribeiro's presentation, this idea that we're not fighting, there's no struggle, that we're too passive. So, what happened here in Chile, or being specific about it, because this is an idea that I've heard oftentimes, and clearly it is about, they're talking about Chile. So there's one singularity here in what happened in this revolt. In October, right? It was the permanence of it. It was a long revolt, long-lasting revolt. Anyways, these, changes are just relative. They were not what people expected. Anyways, but the consequences may be valued differently, right? Or in curious ways. Anyways, we may think that there is a dissolution of these revolts, or I don't know. How do you explain this absence of fight, especially considering all of the singularities of the revolt? Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentations. I've got a general question, because I saw that this could mean different things according to the presentations you were having. So this is a question between the relation between politics and power, fundamentally. The impression I had is that in the reading that Alberto has, politics has nothing to do with power. I also think like that. I would feel identified. I would agree with that because policies don't really have to do with power. But the idea that policies, this idea would lead to this type of facticity of the anarchic unfolding of the politics. So this is like an announcement, right? Because in the end, the unfolding of the facticity, if I understood it properly, would lead to a condition of anarchy of the politics, which is, coming from power. And I believe that both Nelly and Janine Ribeiro, there's a different position, even though they also have different positions, because politics are always connected to some type of articulation of power. So the concept of hegemony are always being stressed in this presentation. This is a question. So I don't really know what your opinion is, and I'm just throwing the question, so you can elaborate it.
Hi, thank you for this panel.
Muchas gracias por este panel. Muchas gracias.
I was listening
Estaba escuchando la traducción de estas ideas de la distancia, la anarquía,
crisis. And being in Santiago for the last few days, I've seen a lot of graffiti on the walls around ACAB. And so I just wanted to throw another word out there for you to chew on, the word abolition. And especially for the first two speakers, of abolition, how does that fit into kind of your thinking about revolt and anarchy?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I cannot ask in Spanish, so voy a preguntar en inglés. Gracias. Tengo una pregunta respecto de la idea.
And I think in Nelly's talk, you suggested that the critic may gain some distance and do all sorts of work but not judge. And then in the last talk, you maintained that you said you don't want to impose values on your students, but for the value of democracy that you will insist on. And I was thinking of a kind of well-known quote by Hannah Arendt, who says at some point, as a critic, she says, we must judge and judge forcefully. And she's very insistent that actually at some moments we judge, and those are value judgments that can't be grounded in some principles. I'm just curious about the distanced critic reframing, finding new frames, doing this kind of work, which is different from what political action is. And that I thought there was an idea that maybe judgment ought to be suspended. But up to what point, and then in the last talk, you said you don't suspend judgment when you teach. You actually say democracy is a value I will not sacrifice or give up on. Muchas gracias.
Le daré la palabra a los panelistas uno por uno. First of all, I want to mention a possible mistake over here. I want to mention it because this is a presentation which is too brief because of the time that we were giving. And of course, in these cases, we run the risk of being too schematic, especially when we try to organize a counterpart and argumentation. So I want to say that I don't want, let's say, my starting point, it is the critical theories. So from there, I think and I write. But I don't want you to think that this is a kind of a disciplinary dispute between, on the one hand, anti-philosophy, philosophy, and the critical theory. Because I believe that this critique, it is an operation. It is a type of operation that goes through everything, all of the different disciplines. And yesterday, Carmi, Rodrigo, one of the lecturers, more privileged lecturers of this writing related to the revolt that I just mentioned, because I believe that an important figure, extraordinary figure, and powerful is him, from what we will call this anti-philosophical philosophy, which is radical. So he himself did an operation which was critical when he, at the very end of his presentation, he spoke about recovering. He didn't say that, but something like recovering the institutions as a territory, a place where we may insert the revolt back. So talking about Alejandro's question, well, I don't really know if the word spontaneity is a word or it's a proper word, but I believe that this revolt was self-created. I will talk about people who self-invited them, and through these assemblies, of course, took ownership of what is public. So they shape an us. And since then, this self-invitation of the revolt breaks what is the traditional social movements, even the students' movement in 2011. And it is also true, what you're saying, it's true. There are many archives involved. Victor Jara, they were listening with Jara, Los Prisioneros Band. I mean, this was a fight against dictatorship. In May 2018, there was some feminist movement. And the archive, there was an archive of disruption, which was what created the revolt in 2019. Or those are the roots of it. No, for me, or in my opinion. And of course, I have no position or bias about it. Because let's say, this unsubmission of the bodies in the street, it is a condition which is fundamental in order to shape collectively to say no to this regime of domination, abuse, and exploitation. At the same time, I believe that it is not a condition enough for giving proper support or fundament to some new ways of composing something at a social or political level. So these people who were self-invited, let's say that way, and we also may mention many misunderstandings about interpretations, which are quite clear after the result of the referendum. Who were the people there in the streets? I mean, this us at Plaza Dignidad. Was the people? Was it just one fraction of the people? Was the people who gets gathered there and invite others once, I mean, they're mentioning what they are pursuing? Or maybe it is the people which is a more classical left wing, and they saw how the collective subject at a certain moment, based on a anti-neoliberal fundament, are there. So the referendum gives us a result, the fracturing of that people, which at a certain time or at a moment was decisive. It was necessary to build. But of course, those were, different subjectivities which coincide in a no to something. We don't want this anymore. I mean, we want all of them to leave, or please stop it. Stop everything. And they do not coincide in the design or the political programs for transformation, as we have seen that occurs. I mean, these multiple decisions of this category of the people within the constituent process, within the list of the people, between the list of the people and this party of the people, and things like that. Because the party of the people and the list of the people, some of their members may have coincided at Plaza Dignidad. They both may have been there. And the name of they mention this direct democracy as well. So the list of the people, it is like, let's say, a democracy where everyone participates. And in the case of the People's Party, it is a pseudo-democracy, which is kind of digital, and it's functional, and we know about it. So all of the different detours within the category, or the differences within the category of people, I don't know, we may think, or someone should think about it, on how to do it, but we need to recreate the narrative of left wing, and that assumes or requires thinking properly what happened, what was broken there. And that's why I have some distance with this notion of the people who cannot be governed, ungovernable people that cannot be submitted. I mean, who's the owner of a power that cannot be subjected or under any power. It cannot be under any power, because just around the corner, the people who is ungovernable, it is governed, and that's what's happening now. So that idea of the people that cannot be governed, I am concerned about it, thinking about this horrors Chile that we're living at, dreadful Chile we're living at. So that's what I wanted to say. And about this judgment, I insisted that what I call the experimentality of the judgment, working with different possibilities, trying new formulas, not creating or not being categoric about saying that this is useful and this is not. I mean, therefore, over there we have this tension, a stress between those writings of the revolt or these lyrics of the revolt, where they ask to suspend this judgment versus experimenting with judgment in order to disassembly and assembly the revolt imaginary. Something like that.
Well, thank you very much. The question about the specificities of the manifestations in Latin America, particularly in Chile and Brazil. Chile had two important families of manifestations in the early 2010s, and then the Great Revolt of 2019, leading to the constituents and the rest. In Brazil, we have in 2013 important manifestations that started, a country was rapidly politicized, which is traditionally conformist, but the problem is that since in Brazil we have not a proper political culture, it's easy to gather all, it's easy that the right and the far right gathers all that, or grabs all that. Even it was put in the in the mouth of the people manifesting the idea that it was against corruption, which would be the legacy of the Workers' Party, which is absolutely wrong. Because it enables the impeachment and Lula's imprisonment. And that was made possible because in Brazil we had the basic idea about the politics. By many people think that politicians are corrupt, and corruption is an interpretation. Because it is not understood that there is a fight in politics between the right and the wing and the left, and that leads people to condemn what should be a different politics. And that happens not only in Brazil, but I think that in the world it's pretty common that the right accuses the left of corruption. I think in South America, in the case of Argentina with Perón, the case of Kirchner, in United States, in Louisiana state with Wei Long, who used to be an important governor because he did a lot of things for the poorest 1 century ago. And in Chile was different because you have a political thing that is above the Brazilian one. Then, after the manifestations 10 or 12 years ago, some of the leaders of the manifestations, such as Camilo Vallejo, were part of the Chilean Congress, whereas in Brazil the only people who became deputies after the manifestations from 2013 were from the far right. like King Katagiri. And then we could say that the legacy to us was a bad legacy. But in Chile, we also have a big problem now because the constitution was drafted in the plebiscite and the constituent was elected not long time ago. If we add right to the far right, they defeated the left overwhelmingly. But this is always possible in these movements. And I remember the paradigm in the elections. It is very possible we can have a retrocess regarding they might be more popular than the elections. And regarding the thing about the values, the last question asked, it is true. I consider that we shouldn't have more specific values such as right or left. Instead, democracy should be considered a really universal value, and this has been a great problem for the communists some decades ago. In Brazil, there was a communist intellectual, and he wrote a book called precisely Democracy as a Universal Value 45 years ago. And nowadays the problem is that the right wing is under an authority is being seduced by the far right, and that's a huge problem, making us remember what happened exactly a century ago in Europe. We clearly need to avoid that from happening. Thank you very much. I will fall into my own trap trying to answer as briefly as possible the questions by Sandro, Federico, and the questions about abolishment. It's difficult, but I will try. And I would say what's not governed is the feasibility of the existence, including the relation resulting from the death or with the mortality itself now involved or related probably for good in the history of the species to the general mortality, the extinction. This is what's not governed, is what politics denies, the nothingness preceding the politics. From the political standpoint, there's nothing to offer to politics, and that nothingness is what I am interested in. That nothingness is the place of what's not governed. Politics is always a broad speech. This is non-governable, subtracts the ethical, and this is why it takes the place of the nothingness. An Antigone would be a figure of what's non-governable, but also Agamemnon, which has to reply or respond to them and the sacrifice. That is the place of the affirmation of the decision of existence from which we may extract where we always store the possibility of annihilating every time this non-governable state is subjugation to its own death by the order of the power, an anarchic power order, or the principle of command. In general, all the tragic Greek thinking is included there. I start from the nation, controversial discussion, that all hegemony is domination. All hegemony is domination. To me, the relation or the ratio of politics power involved to the question of Sandro, precisely because all lack of legitimacy, nihilism brings it with it, the lack of legitimacy, the lack of principle of command. The power itself is anarchist. The capital is anarchist. Capitalism is anarchist. We may choose, therefore, an hegemonic assumption that try to steal hegemony to the bourgeoisie, a counter-hegemonic proposition, but wouldn't be subtracted to the notion of power as domination. Let's remember the famous word of Machiavelli that the rich aim to domination and poor aim not to be subjugated. This not to be subjugated is, to me, the other political possibility. The aims that desires a simultaneous abandonment from power and impotence, then I would start there. There is a decision to be made, even when that decision is motivated in the condition of the present, in the condition of our times. Between two anarchisms, because the power is also anarchist, capital is anarchist, the question about abolishment is such a difficult question, and I believe, probably I am misunderstanding, but you can correct me, it has to do with the discussion or the tendency of the Afro-American thinking, which is called Afro-pessimisms. I don't know if you know it in Chile. Afro-pessimism is like a very radical thinking, very complex, impossible to explain in 1 minute. But I believe that deep down, and this is an affirmation I can stand up for, but I cannot do it explicitly here, Afro-pessimism in the work of CHCI, Harmon and Frank Mota is infrapolitical thinking. That is, it seeks abandonment of the principle of general equivalence. It aims to the principle. It aims to a subtraction, of course, anarchist, at the beginning, general anarchist, which would imply what Sandro was mentioning yesterday, the end of capital as a social relation, as abstraction to the social relation of the capital. This is what proposes the Afro-pessimism from their very radical point, because it goes, because it considers the inhuman. It takes the place of what's human. That is, what's the abolition here of the inhuman is saying, well, I'm going to stop here because it's kind of late now. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias por estar acá. Agradecemos a los panelistas, por cierto.